On Sunday, we defined sin carefully, not simply as bad behavior, but as mistrust expressed in action. Today, we need to go one step deeper. If sin begins with mistrust, where does that mistrust actually live? Genesis 3 gives us a clue. So the serpent does not begin by commanding Eve to disobey. He begins with a question. Did God really say? Now that question may seem kind of small, but it introduces something powerful. It introduces the possibility that God may not be completely trustworthy. So Eve pauses. She begins reasoning with herself. The text says she saw that the tree was good for food. It was very pleasing to the eye and very desirable for gaining wisdom. That moment matters more than we often notice. Before the fruit is taken, something has already shifted inside. Sin does not begin in the hands. It begins in perception. Eve is now looking at the same tree through a different interpretation. What once existed inside a relationship of trust is now being evaluated through suspicion. And that change in perception quietly reshapes everything that follows. Once God is reinterpreted as withholding something good, the relationship moves out of alignment. The action that follows is simply the visible expression of that shift. This helps us see something very important. Adam and Eve do not suddenly become hostile toward God. They simply become unsure. And uncertainty is enough to fracture trust. Most sin does not begin with dramatic rebellion. It begins with a quiet reinterpretation of God's character. The same pattern appears in everyday life. A person lies because they believe telling the truth might cost them something. A person manipulates because they believe control is the only way to stay safe. A person envies because they believe there will not be enough for them. The behaviors are different, but beneath them sits the same belief. I cannot trust God here. That is where sin actually lives. Not first in the action, but in the belief that God's goodness may not apply to this situation. And once that belief settles in, perception changes. Situations start to feel threatening. People start to look like obstacles. Life begins to feel unstable. When perception shifts, behavior follows naturally. Genesis shows what happens next. Adam and Eve hide. They attempt to cover themselves. They begin blaming each other. Notice that progression. Mistrust toward God turns inward first. Shame appears. Then that inward fracture begins to spread outward. Blame replaces honesty. Distance replaces openness. Relationships begin to fracture. Mistrust vertically becomes fragmentation horizontally. This is why sin spreads the way it does. Once trust erodes at the center, everything around it begins to shift. But the story also shows something steady. God comes looking for them. He calls out, "Where are you?" That question is not about geography. God already knows where they are. The question is relational. Even after mistrust has taken root, God moves towards them. That detail matters. Because if sin begins with mistrust, then restoration begins with honesty. Confession is not humiliation. Confession is clarity. It is the moment someone names where mistrust took root. It is saying, here's where I believed something untrue about you. And that kind of honesty creates space for trust to grow again. Now, we should guard against two common misunderstandings. The first is minimizing sin. If we say sin begins with mistrust, someone might assume it is simply insecurity or emotional struggle. But mistrust produces real consequences. Lies damage relationships. Manipulation destroys trust. Greed harms communities. Scripture never treats these outcomes lightly. Sin is serious because it disrupts the relationships life depends on. The second misunderstanding moves in the opposite direction. Some people begin to identify themselves completely with their sin. They assume their worst behavior defines who they are. Genesis does not support that conclusion either. Adam and Eve fail, but they are not abandoned. God speaks with them. God covers them. The relationship is strained, but it is not erased. That tension is important. Sin is serious. Yes, it is. But sin is not the final definition of a human life. Trust can fracture. Trust can also be rebuilt. And rebuilding trust changes behavior in a way fear never could. Think about how this works in ordinary relationships. If trust is broken, the relationship becomes cautious. Every interaction feels tense. But when trust slowly begins to return, behavior changes naturally. Honesty becomes easier. Openness grows. The relationship stabilizes. The same pattern appears in the spiritual life. When someone believes God cannot be trusted, they begin grasping for control. But when trust begins to grow again, something inside relaxes. Obedience stops feeling like negotiation. It begins to feel like alignment. That doesn't mean change happens instantly. Habits still take time to shift. Patterns still require patience. Repair still matters. But the direction changes. Instead of forcing behavior into place, the work becomes learning to trust again. And trust reshapes behavior from the inside out. So, when we ask where sin actually lives, the answer is deeper than the action itself. Sin lives where mistrust toward God becomes belief, and belief reshapes how we see. But the same place where mistrust takes root is also the place where trust can begin again. And when trust grows, life slowly begins to realign. If this brings questions up for you, or if you're recognizing places where mistrust has shaped your life more than you realized, you can reach me below.